Barkmann refused to give up, however. Whenever he saw a vehicle through the oily haze, he had his gunner fire. The fighter bombers continued their assault. Armor-piercing rounds pelted the tank. Bombs continued to fall, but none of the 50-pounders was a direct hit. In the course of the assault from the air, the U.S. tanks started approaching from the flank. Once within range, they opened fire. 2 rounds grazed the Panther. The turret and the long main gun traversed in the direction of the new threat. 2 rounds were fired in quick succession, both direct hits. Thick smoke rising behind the vegetation told Barkmann all he needed to know: 2 more enemy tanks had been knocked out. But the enemy also started to hit. 1 round grazed the hull. Another round dislodged one of the tracks from the drive sprocket. The ventilator in the fighting compartment ceased to function. The loader threw up from the fumes. The tank had literally become a hell on wheels. The main gun ammunition also started to run low. Barkmann thought to himself, should I surrender? But he did not have to follow that train of thought for long, since events soon overcame any deliberations. Heidern, the driver, had placed the sledgehammer. It was usually stowed on the outside of the vehicle. He put it behind him, in the driver's compartment, so as not to risk the chance of losing it in battle. When the vehicle was hit, the sledgehammer dislodged from the place Heidern had stowed it and hit him in the back, causing terrific pain. The pain and the heightened nerves from the fighting had him reach for the driver's hatch to open it. He discovered that it had become jammed as the result of battle damage. Fearing the worst, that he might be caught trapped inside the vehicle, he ripped off his headphones and started to turn the vehicle. Barkmann could not see directly what was happening, but sensed it. Anyway, he called out to the radio operator. "Wilkie, calm him down! He's turning us sideways. He needs to go back to facing the enemy." Wilkie knew what was at stake, but before he could effectively intervene, rounds were slamming into the side of the vehicle. Barkmann tried to restore calm. "Calm down! Pull back!" By then, the driver had regained his composure. Pulling back with a dislodged track and a damaged drive sprocket required immense concentration. While trying to move, they also had to continue to engage the advancing enemy. One of the Shermans that had come closest was knocked out. The tank pulled back to safety and the spot where it had started its adventure. Heinz and Korth were still waiting and greeted the stricken vehicle with raised hands. Korth was the first to speak when he climbed aboard. "You knocked out 9 of their tanks and set another one on fire. I saw it all." Moving at a snail's pace, the tank made it back to a farmer's house in the small village of Neufburg. Once there, they freed the imprisoned radio operator and driver by means of tanker's bars. It was because of them that Barkmann had not abandoned the tank, leaving the 2 crewmen to almost certain death. SS Hauptscharführer Heinz was evacuated to the rear because of his wounds. As a result of Barkmann's actions at the crossroads, the American advance was held up long enough. Many formations that would have been written off were able to escape the attempted American encirclement. Barkmann himself was able to make it to Coutances later that day, picking up 2 immobilized Panthers on the way and towing them along as well. Enemy tanks had already entered the town, however. When 3 of them attempted to block his path, Barkmann knocked them out. Aided by the ammunition he was able to take aboard from the 2 stricken tanks. One of the towed tanks was destroyed by an anti-tank gun and had to be abandoned. While continuing his attempt to get out of the town, he was attacked by fighter bombers again, but they were unable to inflict any serious damage. Another 2 tanks were encountered and knocked out. That brought the kills attributed to Barkmann's crew to 15 over the course of the 2 days. The Seine was crossed on a military bridge. Moving through the next town and its narrow streets, many of the houses were hit by the large vehicles, causing walls to come tumbling down with a crash. At the end of the village, Barkmann's tanks were greeted by the local villages, who offered them flowers and wine, thinking they were the lead American tanks. When the 2 vehicles moved out of the village, they were attacked by fighter bombers again. Kreller, the loader, was slightly wounded. Barkmann was also wounded by shrapnel to his left calf. That afternoon, they reached Granville on the Atlantic coast, where both men were treated. On July 30th, the Americans were outside of the city. Panther 424 broke through an encirclement for the 3rd time, once again with another tank in tow. During the night, he moved unnoticed with an American convoy in the direction of Avranches. During the morning of August 1st, the towed tank had to be blown up. Barkmann's tank was also lost a short while later, when its ammunition went up. The crew had to make its way back to German lines on foot, finally reaching the company on August 5th. Once there, they linked up with other crews that had had to make it back to the German lines on foot. Korth had reached the company earlier, and had already informed the company commander of Barkmann's accomplishments. He was submitted for the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross, which he received on September 5, 1944. Barkmann had been promoted to SS Oberscharführer by the time of the Ardennes offensive. On Christmas Eve 1944, he was part of the lead group of the 4th Company as it was employed against the villages of Mannheim and Grandminal. The regimental commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Enseling, another Knight's Cross recipient, ordered that the advance be continued west. After reaching the villages, the tanks were to continue on to Erzy in order to link up with the Volksgrenadier Regiment attacking there. The company moved out at 2200 hours. SS Hauptscharführer Franz Froscher, a platoon leader and friend of Barkmann's, was in the lead. Barkmann moved behind the company commander. He was serving as the company headquarters section leader and reserve platoon leader. When the main road was reached, Froscher's platoon started to receive fire. One tank started to burn. SS Hauptsturmführer Pohl ordered Barkmann forward to reconnoiter. Barkmann's tank rolled and reached the road. It was a crystal clear night. The heavens were full of stars and the glittery snow on the ground allowed good visibility. Barkmann saw what he thought was Froscher's halted tank. He looked off to the side of the road and determined that the open terrain was negotiable. "Cross the road as quickly as you can," he ordered his driver. Moving as rapidly as it could, the tank reached the far side of the road without incident and took up position in a patch of woods. A short while later, determining the coast was probably clear, Barkmann had his tank move out towards the main road and through the woods. Suddenly, Barkmann saw a silhouette off to the right. The tank commander had his upper torso out of the hatch. In the darkness, Barkmann thought it must be Froscher. He ordered his driver to approach the vehicle. When they were side by side, Barkmann told his driver to kill the engine. "What's going on, Franz?" The man in the other turret disappeared in a flash into his tank and slammed his hatch shut. Barkmann suddenly realized what had happened. He yelled over the intercom. "Gunner, the tank next to us is enemy. Knock it out!" The Panther's turret started to traverse. But the long main gun ran into the other tank's turret. The gunner cried out, "Can't! I'm hitting his turret. Driver, pull back 10 feet, move out!" From the shortest distance imaginable, the gunner then fired into the rear deck of the neighboring tank. Soon, flames were glowing from the engine compartment. Barkmann then ordered his tank to move on. Froscher had to be out there somewhere in front of them. At that point, 2 enemy tanks started rolling out of a cut in the woods towards Barkmann's Panther. The lead tank was set ablaze with the first round. The other tank disappeared into the woods. Barkmann moved out again in order to establish contact with Froscher. The woods started to thin out. To the front was a large open area flanked by woods on all sides. The road made several turns across the open terrain. Barkmann could make out 9 enemy tanks that were in position. Their main guns were trained on the road. Instinctively, the new driver, Grunmayer, halted when he also saw the enemy tanks in his vision port. Barkmann ordered him to continue moving with the same speed. The Panther passed through the U.S. position without being engaged. The Americans must have thought the tank was one of their own. When the German crew had almost passed the group, the U.S. crews started bolting out of their vehicles and heading for the woods. They must have been warned by radio that something was afoot and the Germans were in their lines. "Are we going to knock them out, Oberscharführer?" the driver asked. "We can't afford to lose any time. The ones behind us can take care of them. We need to exploit the enemy's confusion and continue advancing." The next patch of woods was reached. American infantry was marching along the road, getting out of the way of the tank with a curse. The Panther continued moving at high speed. Not a round was fired. Apparently, those men also thought the tank was one of their own. Suddenly, there were houses on both sides of the road. Barkmann's Panther had reached enemy-occupied Mannheim. The tank rolled past the headquarters, reaching a crossroads. The road to the left led to Erzy. He didn't turn. At that point he just wanted to get out of the village. He continued straight ahead in the direction of Liege. But by doing so, Barkmann inadvertently went from the frying pan and into the fire. He ran into the lead elements of a tank column. All of them were Shermans, in groups of 9, apparently in company formations. Parked in between were staff cars with officers in them. The tank crews stood around their vehicles, chattering and smoking. It was a completely crazy situation. Barkmann estimated he moved past at least 10 companies. Little did he know at the time that it was the forward elements of a combat command from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, which had been brought forward to interdict the German advance. All of a sudden, the loader pulled his tank commander down into the fighting compartment and turned up his collar. He pointed to the Knight's Cross dangling at Barkmann's Adam's apple. "It shows up too much in the moonlight, Oberscharführer." Barkmann thanked the old hand for noticing. The loader busied himself laying out belts of ammunition for the coaxial machine gun. Hand grenades were placed within easy reach. The gunner practically became one with his optics, searching the area in front of him, all the while keeping his hand on the traversing controls. The men wanted to be ready for any eventuality. The radio operator attempted to establish contact with the company, but all of his efforts proved to be in vain. The distance had become too great for the shorter-range radio in the tank. The Panther pressed past even more enemy march serials. Suddenly, the driver announced on the intercom, "A vehicle is approaching us." Barkmann peered out of his hatch. He saw that it was a jeep in which an officer was standing. He tried to get the vehicle to stop by using a signal flag. "Run over it," Barkmann commanded. Just as the vehicle started to pick up speed, the jeep driver stopped and put his vehicle in reverse. Despite his evasive maneuver, the distance between the two quickly narrowed. Soon there was a terrific crashing sound as the tank's right track grabbed the jeep. There was a horrific noise, and then the Panther was over and past the wheeled vehicle, reduced to flattened piece of sheet metal and steel. Barkmann saw the officer and driver spring out of the doomed vehicle in the nick of time. In the effort to reorient himself after the crash, the driver then careened into a Sherman. Barkmann held on for dear life in order not to be thrown from the hatch. The Panther's engine died. With its right front drive sprocket jammed into the running gear of the Sherman, the German tank was temporarily stuck. The Americans started yelling orders. "Back up! Back up!" Barkmann yelled to the panic-stricken driver. Finally, he succeeded in starting the engine again. With a terrible rasping sound, the tanks disengaged. The driver then put the tank in gear, and the Panther picked up speed, passing the American combat vehicles. Soon, there was nothing but trains, vehicles, ammo trucks, fuel trucks, field ambulances, and recovery vehicles. Then there was open ground. The Americans were coming to life. Turrets traversed. Engines roared as they were hastily started. They began firing in the general direction of Barkmann's escape route, but the rounds all fell wide of their mark. After about 800 meters, Barkmann had the tank halt. He looked down into the fighting compartment, only to see grinning faces. "Done good, once again!" It was the only thing he could think to say. Soon, however, things turned serious again. Vehicles started pouring out of the village to pursue the solitary invader. Barkmann had the main gun orient to 6 o'clock. The lead vehicles, apparently half-tracks with infantry, were set alight with a few rounds. Then Barkmann started approaching his pursuers. Moving, halting, firing, moving again. He halted 2 more times to fire. In the course of his evasive maneuvering, the Panther had drifted too far. To the northwest. Barkmann corrected course and moved to the left and into a cut in the woods. Using the back roads and trails, he eventually got back to the main road. At first light, he reached Grandmano, where his battalion had set up all-round defenses. His hussars' ride into enemy territory had turned out well. As it turned out, Barkmann had passed Froscher's platoon. Froscher, following behind, soon encountered the 9 tanks that Barkmann had passed through. Although they had been manned again, Froscher's platoon succeeded in knocking them out. Despite that, Froscher himself had to change vehicles 2 times that night, when his own tank was shot out from under him. For his part in the fighting, he received the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross on December 31, 1944. On Christmas Day, Froscher and Barkmann conducted screening operations north of Mannheim together. Towards noon, enemy forces felt their way against the village. Both of the tanks each knocked out an enemy tank. The enemy turned back. When the enemy tanks attacked again in the afternoon, Barkmann was wounded by shrapnel to the head behind his left ear. He collapsed unconscious. The crew evacuated him to Mannheim. During the night of 25th to the 26th of December, he woke up in a main clearing station. On his chest was an evacuation tag for movement to the Military Reserve Hospital in Cologne. Barkmann pulled back the dressing that had been placed on his head and removed the shrapnel embedded in his outer skull by hand. The throbbing headache that plagued him disappeared immediately. He left behind the evacuation tag on his stretcher when he mounted a messenger's motorcycle and rode back to the regiment, where he reported back to duty to SS Obersturmbannführer Ensling. His regimental commander sent a plucky non-commissioned officer to the trains to recover from his wounds. Barkmann was able to take his crew along, where they all enjoyed a few days of rest. On January 18th, Barkmann was again wounded in the head by shrapnel. He remained lucky, even managing to remain with his crew. At the end of that month, the Division Das Reich was moved to Hungary for Operation Sonnenblume. In March, Barkmann and his crew were again engaged in combat. SS Sturmbannführer Kesten, a Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross recipient, was entrusted with command of what remained of the regiment's tanks, which were consolidated into a battalion. SS Untersturmführer Notch led the 4th Company. The company attacked as part of the division between Lakes Valence and Balaton, in a series of ill-fated efforts first to free the besieged city of Budapest as well as to secure Hungarian oil for the Reich. In the course of the fighting, Barkmann again distinguished himself, knocking out 40 34s on one day in the vicinity of Heinrich Major. His battalion was encircled on March 18th. It was able to break out, and was subsequently ordered to the area around Raab. In the process of attempting to rail load for the transport to Raab, the remaining 9 tanks of Barkmann's company found that the Soviets had already bypassed the rail station. The company lost its contact with the division, so it reported for service to the local army commander. In a night fight with Joseph Stalin tanks, the 4th Company lost 3 tanks. With its 6 remaining combat vehicles, the company finally linked up with the tank regiment of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. SS Standartenführer Paper, the regimental commander, attempted to take the tanks and give them to his own tankless crews. In that effort he was mistaken. The men of SS Panzer Regiment Das Reich refused to relinquish their vehicles. From that point forward, the men of the 4th Company screened the rearward movements of the German forces along with Paper's tanks. They were often written off for dead, but they somehow managed to fight their way out and rejoin their countrymen. In one instance, the company knocked out 9 T-34s that were attacking. Finally, the 4th Company made it back to its parent regiment. The regimental commander personally briefed the men on their new defensive positions around Esterhazy. At the beginning of April, they fought at Pandorf, to the south of Vienna. The number of tanks kept dwindling during the subsequent fighting in and around the Austrian capital. On April 12, 1945, Barkmann was on the Bridget Bridge in Vienna on his way back to the regimental command post with 3 Panthers when his tank was knocked out by an Unteroffizier with a Panzerfaust. The panicked non-commissioned officer had mistaken his tank for one of the Soviets. The round entered the turret, and minute shards of shrapnel peppered Barkmann's lower body, his upper thigh area and his lower left arm. Barkmann's new loader was blinded in both eyes. The radio operator also suffered a number of shrapnel wounds. After evacuating the wounded and getting a new radio operator and loader, Barkmann continued on to the regimental command post with his tank. Barkmann was reduced to directing the driver through shouted commands to the loader or gunner, who passed them on since the intercom had been destroyed in the Panzerfaust blast. The next night, his tank bottomed out in a shell crater and could not be recovered. It was then destroyed with a Panzerfaust. At the Floresdorfer Bridge, Barkmann and his crew were employed as infantry. SS Standartenführer Rudolf Lehmann, the new division commander, summoned the seasoned tank commander to him. "Do you think you can make it across the bridge?" "Of course, Standartenführer. Here's what I want, tell Hauptsturmführer Baska to attack and relieve the bridgehead with all of the Panthers of his company." Baska was a Knight's Cross recipient and the commander of the 6th Company. Barkmann took his entire crew with him. One of them would surely get through. The men ran from one span to the next, always followed by enemy fire. All of them reached the far shore. Shortly thereafter, Baska moved out to relieve the bridgehead with his 5 operational Panthers. He served as the tank commander of the 2nd Tank, but it was knocked out while crossing the bridge. The rest of his crew had been killed. Bosca himself was wounded. In that crisis situation, the maintenance sergeant of the 6th Company raced across the bridge in a motorcycle. He picked up the badly wounded company commander and placed him in the sidecar, and then returned followed by bursts of machine gun fire, and made it to the far side. In the vicinity of St. Pölten, northwest of Vienna, Barkmann and SS Untersturmführer Notch both received new Panthers. They linked up with the 6th Company and fought with it. They headed to the west along the Danube, crossing it at Krems. The 6th Company was loaded on trains there to participate in the relief effort directed towards Prague. The war ended as these and other elements were being sped throughout what remained of the Reich in desperate measures to try to stave off the inevitable. Together with his longtime gunner, Poggendorf, Barkmann snuck through the American lines in the Bavarian woods. Later on he played a few tricks on British forces, to make his way through their lines in an effort to make his way to northern Germany and home. After a journey of 1,000 kilometers, he finally reached Schleswig-Holstein. Ernst Barkmann passed away peacefully at his family farm in Kisdorf on June 27, 2009,